There is a particular arithmetic to being sold, and I had done the sums 100 times before anyone ever stood me on the block. I was 21 that spring, old enough by every pack law to answer for a debt, and young enough that the answering still felt like a thing being done to me rather than a thing I had agreed to. The debt was not mine. I want that understood, because the men who tied the cord on my wrist that morning said the word yours so many times that I nearly began to believe them, and I have spent a long while since making sure I never do. My father had died owing Lord Hesper more than our holding was worth, and under the old bond law, a dead man's debt falls to the eldest unwed child of his blood, and that was me. My brother Tam was 9. My mother had not left her bed since the burying, so when the cord came, I held out my arm myself, because the only dignity left to a woman in my position is the choice of how she lets the inevitable happen. And I was not going to let them see me snatched. They tie it in red, the debt cord, a loop of dyed wool knotted twice at the pulse, so that everyone in the auction yard can see at a glance that you are not a person that day, but a sum. I remember the exact colour of it. I remember thinking it was a stupid, cheerful colour for the worst morning of my life. The yard was full. Bond auctions always draw a crowd, the way a hanging does. People who would never bid come to watch other people's ruin and feel warm about their own luck. Hesper sat above it all on a cushioned chair with a ledger open on his knee, and he had the soft, unbothered face of a man who has discovered that other people's catastrophes can be made to pay rent. He did not look at me. I was a line in his book that was about to balance. I had decided I would not weep, and I would not beg, and I would meet the eye of whatever man bought me so that he would know from the first hour exactly what kind of trouble he had purchased. That was my whole plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only one I owned outright. And then the yard went quiet, all at once, the way a forest goes quiet, and I understood before I turned that the Alpha King had come. I had never seen him close. No one of my rank does. Garrick of the Iron Territories was a rumour I had grown up under, the way you grow up under weather. The strongest wolf alive, the boy who took the throne at 20 and had not lost a span of ground since. A man whose name was used to frighten children into sleeping. I had pictured something enormous and cruel. What came through the gate was a tall man in a plain dark coat who moved through the crowd as though the crowd were furniture, and whose face, when I finally got it in my sights, was doing none of the things I had braced for. He was looking at the cord on my wrist. Only the cord. He looked at it the way you look at a thing that has happened to you before. Hesper was on his feet so fast the ledger nearly went into the dirt. A king at a bond auction was unheard of. Kings sent stewards if they sent anyone. He began to babble about the honour, the unexpected honour, and Garrick did not appear to hear him. "What is owed?" the king said. Not to me, to the yard. Hesper named the sum. It was an obscene sum. It was the sum that had eaten my whole life. "Paid," Garrick said, and a man behind him stepped forward with the coin already counted, as though the king had known the figure before he arrived, which I have since learned he had. Because Garrick of the Iron Territories never once in his life walked into a room without knowing what it would cost to walk back out. So, I was bought. I had rehearsed this moment. I lifted my chin and found his eyes, and gave him the look I had been saving, the one that promised he had not purchased a quiet thing. He crossed the yard, took the loose end of the bond cord between 2 fingers, and untied it. Not cut, untied. He worked the double knot loose at my pulse with the care of a man diffusing something, and he did it without letting his hand touch more of me than the cord required. And when it came free, he did not keep it. He folded it once and held it out, the red wool lying across his open palm for me to take. "This is yours," he said. "It was never anyone else's." Then he took the contract from his own man, the bond paper, the thing that made me a sum, and he held it up so the yard could see the line at the bottom where a buyer signs his claim. And the line was empty. He handed me that too, unsigned. "The debt is discharged," he told Hesper, told the crowd, told me. "There is no claim, there is no contract. Good morning." And he walked out of the yard the way he had walked into it, through the people like furniture, and left me standing on the block, holding my own freedom in 2 hands, and not one earthly idea what had just been done to me, or why. The court, I would learn, understood it no better than I did. I want to be honest about what I felt, because gratitude is the easy thing to claim, and it would be a lie. I did not feel grateful. I felt furious, and I could not have told you at whom. He had reached into the worst morning of my life and lifted the weight off me, and asked for nothing. And somehow that was its own kind of unbearable, because a debt you can repay is a debt you can be free of, and a kindness that asks nothing leaves you owing in a currency that does not exist. I went home. I freed my mother and my brother of the bond, and then, because I am my father's daughter in the one way that matters and none of the ways that don't, I walked the half day to the fortress to give the money back. This is the part where the king became ridiculous, and I fell, without noticing, into the habit of him. I never saw Garrick again that day. I was met instead by a steward who met me with a letter, and the letter was the first of what I can only call the campaign. It was written in a hand of such excruciating formality that I read it 3 times before I understood it was, underneath, terrified. It thanked me for my visit. It regretted that the king was occupied with matters of state. It informed me that the sum I wished to return could not be returned, as no debt existed, and that to insist would be to create a debt where there had been none, which the king's honour could not permit. It then, and here I had to sit down on the steward's bench to keep reading, formally requested the favour of my acquaintance, at my convenience, under no obligation whatsoever, and listed 3 afternoons on which the king would be available, with a 4th offered should none of the first 3 suit. A man who could buy and unmake my entire life with a word had sent me a letter asking, with the desperate precision of a siege engineer, whether I might like to talk to him sometime. I did not answer it. I told myself it was pride. It was partly pride. The second letter came 4 days later, and was worse, because it had clearly been agonized over. It inquired whether I had received the first letter. It allowed that I might not wish to respond, which it fully respected. It mentioned, with the air of a man laying down a winning card he is not sure is winning, that the fortress library contained the only copy west of the sea of a treatise on grafting fruit trees, which the steward had been given to understand I had once expressed an interest in. I had expressed an interest in grafting fruit trees exactly once, to a fruit seller in my own village, 8 days before the auction. I sat with that letter for a long time. A man does not learn what a stranger said to a fruit seller by accident. He learns it because he asked carefully of someone what she cared about, and then offered her the one thing he owned that matched it, as though a book on apples were a fortune, which to him, I would later understand, it was, because it was the only language of giving he had that did not come with a cord attached. I went to read the treatise on grafting fruit trees. He was in the library when I arrived, which I am certain was an accident he had spent 2 days arranging. He stood when I came in, too fast, and knocked a stack of papers, and caught them, and set them down with the over-careful steadiness of a man who has decided that this conversation will go well through sheer force of preparation. "You came about the trees," he said. "I came about the money. The trees are leverage." His mouth did something it plainly was not used to doing. "Yes," he said, "they were intended as leverage. I am told I am not subtle." "You bought a woman at auction and gave her back to herself in front of 200 people. No, you are not subtle." He had no answer ready for that. I watched him not have one. It was, I think, the first moment I liked him, that small, visible failure of the campaign, the gap where the prepared man ran out of preparation and just stood there, caught in the open with whatever was underneath. If you have come with me this far, come a little further, because the next thing I learned about him I was not supposed to learn, and once I knew it, I could no more have walked away from this man than I could have left my own name on Hesper's block. If this story has its hooks in you, you know what to do. Leave the little spark of a like and stay close. We talked about trees. We talked, eventually, about everything except the trees. I came back. I told myself each time it was the last time, and each time he had found some new, ridiculous, formal pretext. A question about orchard soil he could not possibly care about, a second treatise he had clearly bought specifically, an invitation to advise the Kitchens on the spring planting that the Kitchens had not requested and were baffled to receive. The whole fortress had begun to watch the king court a debtor's daughter with the grace of a man fording a river in full armour, and the whole fortress had no idea what to do with it, and I will confess that watching them not know became one of the small, private pleasures of my life. He never once presumed. That is the thing I keep returning to. A man had paid a fortune for me, and then spent every week since asking, formally, anxiously, leaving every door open, whether I might consider, of my own free and unpurchased will, simply staying near him. He had freed me first, and then set about trying to win me, in that order, as though the order were the most important thing in the world. I did not understand yet why the order was the most important thing in the world. I found out by accident, which is the only way I ever find out anything that matters. It was a cold afternoon, and he had been called away mid-conversation to deal with a dispute among his northern wolves, and I was alone in his library, where I had no business being alone, and I am a woman who reads the spines of other people's books, because you cannot hide who you are from the books you keep. On a high shelf, behind a row of treaties, pushed back where a guest would not reach, there was a small wooden box. I should not have opened it. I opened it. Inside was a bond cord. Red wool, dyed the same stupid cheerful colour as mine had been, knotted twice, but old, the red gone brown at the folds, frayed soft with handling, the cord of someone who had kept a thing far too long and taken it out far too often. And under it, a single folded page, a bond contract, the ink faded, the hand archaic. The buyer's line on that contract was signed. The thing being sold, named in the cramped old script at the top, was a boy, 6 years of age, surrendered by his own pack to the house of his pack's creditor, to be held as a bond ward against a treaty debt until such time as the debt was discharged or the ward was of no further use. The creditor's house, named on the line where a buyer signs his claim, was the house of Hesper. I was still holding it when Garrick came back. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the open box and the brown-red cord and the page in my hands, and every piece of the campaign, all the formal armour, all the careful preparation, fell off him at once, and what was left standing in the doorway was not the strongest wolf alive. It was the boy from the contract, grown tall, who had spent 30 years learning to be feared precisely so that no one would ever again be able to do to him what that page said had been done. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I had a letter drafted, 3 drafts, none of them—" He stopped. "There is no formal way to say it." "Then say it the other way." My own voice came from somewhere very quiet. "Say it like a person." He came into the room. He did not come close. He stood with the width of the table between us, the way he always did. The distance I had stopped noticing was a kindness. "My pack owed a debt it could not pay," he said. "So they paid it with me. I was 6. Hesper's father held my cord until I was 16, and strong enough that holding it became dangerous. The day I could, I took it back myself. I have spent every year since buying out every bond cord I can reach across these territories, quietly, through stewards, so that no one knows the king cares, because a king who is known to care about debtors becomes a king whose enemies make debtors of the people he loves." His eyes came up to mine. "Yours was the one I could not reach in time through a steward, so I came myself. I could not. I stood in that yard, and I saw the cord on your wrist, and I could not let it be signed, not because of who you were. I did not yet know who you were, because of what it was." I understood it all then, in one cold rush. The unsigned line, the cord untied and not kept, the fortune that asked nothing. He had not bought me. A man who had been bought could not have borne to. He had refused, in front of 200 people, to let the worst thing that had ever happened to him happen to a stranger. And then, only then, once I was free and owed him nothing, had he let himself find out that he wanted me to stay. It undid me. I will not pretend it didn't. The fury I had carried since the block, the unrepayable debt of his kindness, it turned over in me and became something else, something with no name and no cord, and I had to put the page down and grip the edge of the table. because the floor of my certainty had quietly gone out from under me. "Why are you telling me?" The question came out flat. "You didn't have to. I'd never have known." "Because you asked me to say it like a person," he said. "And I find that I would rather be a person to you than a king to anyone else." Hesper came for us within the fortnight. Of course he did. A man whose entire fortune is built on debts does not take kindly to a king who unmakes them, and a man whose house once owned that king takes it as a personal affront that the property has opinions. He came the first time through the law. He stood up in the great hall before the assembled court and a delegation of southern lords whose goodwill the king needed, and he produced a writ. Under the old bond law, he argued, a debt discharged by a third party without the creditor's written consent was not discharged at all. It was merely transferred. He had never consented in writing to release my father's debt. Therefore, the debt stood. Therefore, the cord was lawfully his to retie. He had come, he said, with great regret, to reclaim what the king had so generously attempted to spirit away. It was a good trap. It was a lawyer's trap, and half the southern lords were nodding, because the old law did say what he said it said, and a king who simply overruled the law to keep a woman would prove he was exactly the kind of king who bends the law for what he wants, which is the one accusation that brings a pack down faster than any blade. I watched Garrick understand that his fortune and his word were not enough, that to save me by command would cost him the thing the command rested on, and I watched him decide, in the space of a breath, to spend the only coin Hesper could not counter. "You are quite right about the law, Lord Hesper," the king said, and the hall stilled. "A debt must be discharged before its proper authority, or not at all. So let us discharge it properly. Let us do it the old way, the oldest way." He turned to the court, and his voice did not shake. "And I will carry the cost of what it must have taken not to let it shake for the rest of my life. Under the same bond law my lord is so fond of, a debt may always be discharged by the debtor's own blood oath, sworn freely, witnessed. It cannot be transferred, it cannot be reclaimed. It is the one settlement no creditor may refuse. I know this law better than any wolf in this hall." He let that sit. "I know it because I was a bondward of the house of Hesper from the age of 6, and it is the law by which I freed myself." The hall did not breathe. He had done it. He had stripped his own armour off in front of the southern lords and the court and the world, told them the strongest wolf alive had once been a sum in another man's ledger, handed his deepest shame to a room full of people who traded in weakness, and in doing it, he had taken Hesper's writ and turned it to ash, because no creditor may refuse a blood oath, and now everyone in the hall knew the king could invoke it, and why. Hesper's face had gone the colour of old paper, but he was not finished, and this is the part where he nearly won. "How touching," he said, recovering, smooth as a turned key. "Then by all means let the debtor swear. Let the girl come forward and open her own veins for a debt that was her father's, before all these witnesses, and we shall see how freely she does it, with the king's eyes upon her." He smiled. "Unless, of course, His Majesty intends to swear it for her, in which case the oath is his, not hers. The debt becomes the king's own, and the king has bound himself by blood to a creditor's daughter in open court, which I imagine the southern lords will find very interesting indeed. There it was, the real trap, underneath the first. If Garrick swore for me, he chained himself publicly to a debt, and to me, and gave Hesper a king on a string. If he let me swear, Hesper got to watch me bleed for his amusement, and, he plainly hoped, falter. A frightened girl, faltering at the blade, the debt left half-sworn and reclaimable, the whole thing collapsing back into his hand. He had built the trap for the king. He had forgotten to account for me. People always do. It is the single most useful thing about being a woman no one looks at. I came forward before Garrick could move. "I'll swear it." The hall turned to me the way it turns to a king, and I found I did not mind the weight of all those eyes the way I had thought I would. It was never the king's debt, it was never even mine, but I am the one the law named, so I am the one who'll end it. Bring the blade. Garrick said my name once, low, a warning and a plea, and I did not look at him, because if I had looked at him, I would have lost my nerve, and a person only gets to do a thing like this once. They brought the oath blade and the old bowl. I will not pretend the cost was nothing. The blade was cold, and the law that lived in it was older and colder, and when I drew the edge across my palm, the blood that came was warm, and the magic of the thing was not. It pulled at me, the way deep water pulls, a debt's worth of weight trying to settle somewhere, and I had to set my jaw and hold my opened hand over the bowl and say the old words steady, while the cold of it climbed my wrist, looking for the place I keep myself. I said them steady. I watched my own blood fall, and I named the debt, and I swore it discharged by my blood and my will, freely given, owed now to no one, and I felt the weight find the floor at last, and let go. When it was done, I lifted my eyes, not to the court, not to Hesper, to him, and I held up my own opened hand, the way he had once held up an unsigned line, and I said the thing I had not planned and have never once regretted. There, now I owe you nothing. I let the room hear it, which means that whatever I do next, I do because I want to, not because you bought it. You made very sure of that, my Lord King. It was the most foolish, generous thing anyone has ever done. And it worked. I have been told that what happened to Garrick's face in that moment is the reason half the court forgave him everything. I did not see it. I was watching Hesper, who had built a beautiful trap to catch a king, and had instead been quietly disarmed by a debtor's daughter with a cut hand, and who understood, as the southern lords began, one by one, to look away from him, that he had lost the room. And a man who trades in debts cannot survive the day a room decides he is the one who is bankrupt. The fallout was not gentle, because nothing in that world ever is. Hesper's writ was void. You cannot reclaim a blood-sworn debt. But more than that, the king had said the unsayable in open court, and a thing said cannot be unsaid. And for a season there were lords who whispered that a once-owned king was a weak one. Garrick let them whisper. He had calculated that cost too, I think, the way he calculated everything, and he had decided that the truth told plainly was worth more than the secret held forever, which is a lesson it took him 30 years and 1 auction yard to learn. What broke Hesper was not the king. It was the ledger. With the law against him and the court turned, the debtors he held began, very quietly, to invoke the old blood oath themselves. Every one of them, all across the territories, discharging their bonds by their own hands before witnesses, the way the king had shown them could be done. A creditor with no enforceable debts is only a man with a book full of crossed-out names. Within the year, his house was sold to pay its own arrears. I am told the cord he kept on his ledger to tie the sold was, in the end, used to bind the boxes when they carried his things away. I am not above admitting I enjoyed hearing it. There is more to tell, and most of it is quiet, which is how I like things now. The king courted me for one more season after the hall, badly, formally, with letters I kept every one of, until the afternoon I told him he could stop writing letters, because I had decided to stay, and he could put the matter to me directly if he had the nerve. He had the nerve. He asked me, like an ordinary man, with no list and no leverage and no fortune in his hands, whether I would have him, knowing I owed him nothing and could walk out of the fortress that hour and never look back. I will not describe the moment he understood my answer, except to say that the kiss was the first thing in my life I did not weigh the cost of first, and that something in me that had been doing arithmetic since the day my father died finally, blessedly, put down the sums. It is 2 years now. Tam is 12 and underfoot in the fortress kitchens, which he treats as his personal kingdom. My mother keeps the orchard, of all things, having read the king's ridiculous treatise cover to cover and pronounced it mostly wrong. The court has stopped whispering. A king who told the truth about the worst thing that ever happened to him turned out, in the end, to be harder to frighten than a king with a secret. And the southern lords learned it the way everyone eventually learns things about Garrick. Too late and to their cost. The red cord, mine, the one he untied and gave back, sits in the same small wooden box on the high shelf, beside the old frayed brown one that used to be his. He keeps them together now. I asked him once why he did not simply burn them both, and he thought about it for a long moment, the way he thinks about everything, and said that a cord you have chosen to keep is a different thing from a cord that was tied on you, and that he had spent his whole life unable to tell the difference, and would rather keep them where he could see that he finally could. I think about that more than I let him know. He still cannot quite believe, some mornings, that I am here because I chose it, and not because he paid for it. I watch him not quite believe it, over breakfast, in the small, unguarded way he has, and I do not always reassure him, because a woman is entitled to be wanted that much, and because the slow, daily proving of it is the truest thing either of us owns. So that is the whole account, the debt that was never mine, the king who paid it and asked for nothing, the cord untied in front of 200 people, and the blood I spilled to make sure that whatever came after, I came to it free. I have wondered, telling it, how soon you understood what he was really doing in that yard, whether you saw it before I did, which would not be hard, since I was rather busy being furious. Tell me then, did you guess why he left the line unsigned? And has anyone ever given you a thing and asked for nothing back? And did it undo you the way it undid me? Sit with me a while in the comments and say where you are listening from tonight. If this found you and lifted something you had been carrying, stay close. Leave the spark. Keep the cord. and I will have another for you when the cold comes round again. Stay warm. I will be here.